If you had to list all 50 US states from most interesting to least interesting borders, where would you rank Ohio? Chances are somewhere between 49 and 52. I can't blame you. What could possibly be interesting about Ohio? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Ohio's borders were laid down by the lazy, the lying, the cheating, and the conniving. It's a story of theft, fraud, kidnapping, the first American Civil War, and a man named after a number. In this video, we'll cover all the twists, turns, and even the straight lines of Ohio's borders. I'm Gate Nerd. This is Studio Alpaca, and if you think the shape of states is boring, or that the history of borders isn't full of surprises, well, you must have never met Ohio.
Thought that I was growing older, wiser, understanding why this world held nothing for my spirit. Thought that I was destined to be nothing in this world, and then I'll make it.
Our journey begins with, if you can believe it, Americans fighting over Ohio, but not fighting over who got to avoid it, instead, over who got to own it. The original 13 colonies had been united in their hatred for the British, but when the British were suddenly gone, the relationship between the 13 original states was tenuous at best. Among the first fights between the states was what to do with the spoils of war. The 1782 Treaty of Paris ended the Revolution and handed over all British possessions east of the Mississippi River and south of Canada to the Americans. This territory would eventually be carved into 13 additional states, and more than doubled America's size overnight. Vast swaths of this land had hardly been explored up to that point, let alone settled. States immediately started fighting over who would get a piece of this new land. They haphazardly claimed anything west of themselves in a bid to secure resources, farmland, and power. The southern states, like Virginia and North Carolina, simply extended their borders straight west, claiming everything as far as the Mississippi. At this point in history, rivers were easily the best way of dividing land, since maps weren't good enough to reliably draw straight lines yet. Sure, rivers move, but at least everyone could agree they existed. Arguably the most important river in the young US was the Ohio River. Connecting western Pennsylvania to the Mississippi, it was a vital means of transport through the heart of the country. The Ohio also served as a de facto border between the expansionist South and the expansionist North, since Virginia didn't bother to claim anything north of it. This territory to the north and west of the Ohio River was rather uncreatively named the Territory North and West of the River Ohio, but quickly shortened to the Northwest Territory. Obviously, looking back, naming this the Northwest Territory was a bit short-sighted, but to be fair, the country did stop at the Mississippi. Upon the creation of the territory, there was just one slight problem. The northern states, not to be outdone by the likes of Virginia, had executed land grabs of their own. These claims were remarkably even more outlandish than those south of the Ohio. Despite having no land connection to the claim, and hardly any reason other than the sheer hell of it, Connecticut declared ownership over territory 10 times larger than the state itself. Its claim ran from Pennsylvania's original western border all the way to the Mississippi River. This is a to-scale comparison of what Connecticut is today versus what could have been. As you might guess, this did not go over well with the other states, specifically the ones that weren't quick enough to get any new land. The aptly named unlanded states, including Maryland and New Jersey, were reasonably upset that their landed counterparts could simply draw a line on a map and claim it as their own. They weren't so much mad at the concept, mind you, just that they didn't snag a piece for themselves. To resolve their dispute, the unlanded states did what any self-respecting state would do, and threw a tantrum. They refused to ratify the Constitution until Connecticut and others gave up their ill-gotten western lands. Fortunately, Connecticut's governor, Samuel Huntington, was a staunch Federalist who believed in a strong national government. Since that plan was sure to fall apart if secession were on the table, Huntington ceded the state's western territories to New York and the newly formed Northwest Territory. The other states begrudgingly followed suit. If you're enjoying the video so far, why not give it a like and Studio Alpaca a follow? Couldn't hurt, could it? Is hitting the bell too much to ask? Yeah, probably, but what if I said please? While you're at it, why not pop down to the comment section and let us know your favorite thing about Ohio? And you should get to it now. By the end of the video, you probably won't have anything nice to say. After Connecticut acquiesced to appease its fellow states, there were still 2 areas north of the Ohio left under the control of their claimant states: the Connecticut Western Reserve and the Virginia Military Survey. Oh wait, didn't I say that Virginia wasn't greedy enough to call dibs on land north of the Ohio? Yeah, well, it turns out they were, and they got away with it too, in spite of those meddling northerners. Likewise, Connecticut still held out a sliver of its original claim, now called the Connecticut Western Reserve, the namesake of Cleveland's Case Western Reserve University. Virginia and Connecticut kept these lands to serve as payment for veterans of the Revolutionary War. They didn't actually plan on maintaining jurisdiction over the land, and legally speaking, it was all within the Northwest Territory. The states just needed a way, other than money, which they didn't have much of, to pay veterans. This had the additional perk of incentivizing settlers to head out west, a common theme that we'll see throughout American history. The Northwest Territory was officially established in 1787 with the passage of the Northwest Ordinance. The Ohio River served as its southern border, eventually becoming Ohio's borders with West Virginia and Kentucky. The next border to be decided was Ohio's eastern border. It was also set long before Ohio became a state. It wasn't until the 1780s that Pennsylvania actually got around to defining its western edge. Connecticut had laid claim to most of what is today western Pennsylvania by extending west of the Susquehanna River. Settlers from Connecticut proved the land was ripe for agriculture, so Pennsylvania decided it was rightfully theirs. The amount of thought they put into their western border beyond that, though, was minimal. You see, Pennsylvania had just come to an agreement with Maryland and Virginia about where its southern border, called the Mason-Dixon Line, would be. This would come to be the true dividing line between the North and South. However, the Mason-Dixon abruptly ends in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, but hey, Pennsylvania figured that was good enough. In 1784, Andrew Ellicott, who had worked on the Mason-Dixon, was hired to mark a line going straight north from where the Mason-Dixon ended to the southern shore of Lake Erie. The border he surveyed bears his name as a result. The Ellicott Line was where Pennsylvania ended and the Northwest Territory began. It would eventually become Ohio's eastern border. This left the Connecticut Western Reserve with only 5,500 square miles, just barely the size of Connecticut itself. By the time the Northwest Territory was established and its eastern boundary defined, the next hurdle to get over was actually doing something with the land. No permanent American settlements had been made in the territory. Hell, there was barely anybody living in the western half of Pennsylvania for that matter. As it turns out, carving up land on a map is one thing. Actually settling it proved to be far more complicated. What became Ohio was the first place to be settled in the Northwest Territory, if only because it was the closest to the rest of the country. The first American settlers into the territory were led by Rufus Putnam. Originally from Massachusetts, Putnam was a general in the Revolutionary War. He purchased over 2,000 square miles of the brand new Northwest Territory where the Muskingum River met the Ohio. His group established the town of Marietta in 1788, making it the oldest city in Ohio. Putnam and his Ohio company paid a total of $1 million for the land, which was to be divided into 6 mile squares, each with its own township. The deal struck with the federal government also required 2 of these townships to be set aside for 2 future universities. One of these is Ohio University, located in Athens. I only bring this up to ensure that this video features at least one Bob. Putnam and others who followed weren't the first to live in the area, though. It was actually heavily populated by Native American tribes long before their arrival. The native Ohioans nicknamed these European newcomers Buckeyes, since their big round eyes reminded them of the nuts of the local Buckeye tree. The nickname stuck, although the term could just as easily apply to anyone with European features. Want to make an Ohioan mad and a Michigander even madder? Just call them both Buckeyes and thank me later. 2 years after Putnam, a New Jerseyan named Benjamin Stites was visiting some friends in northern Kentucky when some of their horses were stolen by a band of Shawnee. The Shawnee were one of the larger eastern woodlands tribes. At the tail end of British rule, the Shawnee and other tribes in the region were recognized as sovereign, with the Proclamation of 1763 codifying Shawnee ownership over their existing territory. Long before Putnam's Ohio Company, Shawnee villages throughout the region boasted thriving populations over 1,000, a number it took until 1820 for a white settlement, Cincinnati, to surpass. Ohio was far from an untamed wilderness by the time Putnam arrived. The early history of the Northwest Territory was not, in truth, settlers building something from nothing. Rather, it was them seizing what had already been built by the Shawnee. For decades, American settlers waged a constant and brutal campaign against the natives. Shawnee towns were raided, their livestock stolen, and their farms burned by the encroaching Americans. Like so many other tribes, the Indian Removal Act finalized the American seizure of the Shawnee's homeland. They were marched west of the Mississippi into Missouri and Kansas, where they set about rebuilding. In the 1850s, their Kansas reservation caught the attention of settlers who again seized everything from the Shawnee. They were again forced onto a new, even smaller reservation in what is today northeast Oklahoma. In total, Shawnee reservations take up less than 25 square miles of land, 1,000 miles from their historic territory. Estimates put the modern Shawnee population at approximately 12,000. That's less than their population 300 years ago. In the era we're discussing, the United States systematically exterminated so many Shawnee that their society and population were set back by generations, by centuries. There are 3 federally recognized Shawnee tribes today: the Shawnee Tribe, Eastern Shawnee Tribe, and Absentee Shawnee Tribe, all headquartered in Oklahoma. Unfortunately, the story of Ohio's borders is largely free of any influence of the Shawnee or any other tribes with roots in the modern state. Notice, though, that I didn't say entirely free of influence. Keep that in mind as we get back to our good buddy Stites and his friends' stolen horses. He pursued the Shawnee for days, traveling far into the Northwest Territory. During his trek, he was impressed with the beauty of the land and grew increasingly confident it was ideal for settlement. As soon as he made it home to New Jersey, Stites informed his good friend John Cleve Symmes of his discovery. Symmes was a well-known and considerably wealthy man who had been New Jersey's representative to the Continental Congress and justice of its Supreme Court. But he's not to be confused with his nephew, John Cleve Symmes Jr., one of the largest proponents of the Hollow Earth theory, perhaps a topic for a future video. Symmes was inspired to make a purchase just like Putnam's Ohio Company had. The land he purchased was legally defined as the area between the Great Miami River and the Little Miami River, all north of the Ohio. With his deed in hand, Symmes could set about dividing up his land into parcels and selling to would-be settlers who were sure to fight tooth and nail for their slice of Ohio. This venture was incredibly profitable, helped a great deal by some, let's say, creativity. John Cleve Symmes sold plots of land just like he was supposed to. He then realized that if he simply sold this same plot of land to another buyer, he'd make twice as much money, even more if he sold to a third or fourth buyer. While he was at it, he started selling deeds for land outside his allotment. He was the most powerful man for hundreds of miles. It's not like the government could do anything about it. Luckily for Stites, he bought the first of the Symmes deeds before any of the chicanery started. All this shady business did eventually catch up with Symmes, though. I'm just kidding. The fortune and reputation he built helped both his son-in-law and great-grandson become president. He also will not be the last person to lie and cheat his way to fame and riches in Ohio. Thanks to all these settlements popping up, Congress decided the Northwest Territory was too large and set about splitting the territory in two by birthing the Indiana Territory. The dividing line made sure to keep all of the properly settled parts of the eastern part of the territory in the Northwest Territory. Already regretting that name, huh? The border started here, where the Kentucky River met the Ohio, and ran northeast until it reached the newly established Fort Recovery, the furthest west fort in the territory. From Fort Recovery, the border went straight north until it reached British Canada, bisecting both Michigan peninsulas in the process. This slightly bent border lasted until just before Ohio's ascension to statehood in 1803, when it was altered slightly. Instead of the Kentucky River marking the border with Indiana, Ohio's Congress decided to use the Great Miami River, since it marked the western edge of the Symmes Purchase. That was the farthest anyone had actually lived in the territory. It also didn't set right with the new Ohioans to define their own state with a river named for and entirely located within Kentucky. Because the Symmes Purchase defined the western edge of the state through a series of very unlikely events initiated by the theft of some horses, at least part of Ohio's modern shape is thanks to the Shawnee. With that, the shape of Ohio is beginning to emerge. The east, west, and south have all been set. Only the northern border needed to be decided. The story of how that came to be, however, is among the most dramatic events in American history, culminating in what could be called the First American Civil War. In 1802, when Ohio was finally ready to become a fully fledged state, the Northwest Territory looked like this. As much as Ohio would have liked to keep all of it, the good old Northwest Ordinance had doomed them to Michiganectomy. The ordinance stated that the territory must be divided into, quote, not less than 3 nor more than 5 states. That simple rule didn't work out since we're actually left with 6. Well, at least more than 5. It also stated that these states would be divided by an east and west line drawn through the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan. These two declarations were well intended, but had one teeny tiny problem. No one had actually bothered to find the southernmost point of Lake Michigan. This turned out to be a bigger issue than anyone anticipated. At the time, the US government was relying on this, the Mitchell Map of 1755, which, to be fair, was the most accurate survey they had of the Great Lakes region. Compared to a modern map, you can immediately spot some discrepancies. Importantly, the Mitchell Map showed Lake Michigan 26 miles further north than it should be. When drafting their state constitution, Ohio had considered the possibility Lake Michigan wasn't where the Mitchell Map said it was. You see, Ohio wanted to make sure they retained some land on the shore of Lake Erie over here, specifically the Cape of the Miami River. This Miami River was later renamed the Maumee, closer to the original Shawnee pronunciation. I'll be using this name anachronistically to avoid confusion with the other 2 Miami rivers in southwest Ohio. Ohio wanted to make sure to set their borders so they could keep a small settlement quickly growing at the Cape of the Maumee. This unimpressive town eventually became the unimpressive city of Toledo. To guarantee continued ownership of Toledo, Ohio's state constitution defined its northern border as a diagonal line running from the southernmost point of Lake Michigan to the northernmost point of the Maumee River. If Lake Michigan was where the Mitchell Map said it was, this would be no issue. But if Lake Michigan were actually farther south, a line running straight east like the Northwest Ordinance called for would end just below Toledo. With a diagonal line written into their constitution, Ohio ensured Toledo would be part of their state. When Ohio gained statehood in 1803, all of the remaining lands north of its border, wherever that border may be, were given to the Indiana Territory. 2 years later, this entire peninsula was broken off as the Michigan Territory. When Congress created Michigan, though, they defined its southern boundary with the original definition from the Northwest Ordinance, not the diagonal line from Ohio's Constitution. This meant that Michigan and Ohio both had their own contradictory borders. The discrepancy is small, but it does lead to this blue area, 468 square miles of land claimed by both Ohio and Michigan. Unsurprisingly, Ohio was less than pleased with this congressional oversight. They held firm to their constitution, refusing to give Michigan an inch. They asked the feds to make an official survey of their northern border and choose whose was correct. Congress obliged and in 1812 commissioned the survey. The man responsible for marking and defining the border was U.S. Surveyor General Edward Tiffin. He had a little bit of bias in the matter, though, since he was, in fact, a former governor of Ohio. To be specific, he was the first governor of Ohio. He was also the man who had written the Constitution of Ohio, or at least he was the first to sign it when they were done. As you probably guessed, Tiffin chose to survey the border as he had laid out in Ohio's Constitution. To this end, he hired surveyor William Harris to mark the border, and the line he surveyed became known as the Harris Line. The territorial governor of Michigan, Lewis Cass, said that Harris's line and the obviously biased decision from Tiffin was only adding strength to the strong and making the weak still weaker. In protest, Cass hired his own team of surveyors led by John A. Fulton to survey the border according to Michigan, with his being named the Fulton Line. The land between the Harris and Fulton lines was named the Toledo Strip, of course named after the crown jewel of the disputed territory. Settlers from both sides moved into the Strip for the next several years. There were people living in the Toledo Strip confident they lived in Ohio, and many more who proudly swore they lived in Michigan. But since Michigan was only a territory, the issue was largely ignored. Their argument was fairly strong, though, as their border had been signed into law more recently than Ohio's. They could also argue that because it was the same as defined in the Northwest Ordinance, their border predated Ohio's. Unfortunately for Michigan, logic and reason hardly mattered. As a territory, they had less power than Ohio. By 1833, however, Michigan met all of the requirements to become a state, and asked Congress for admission to the Union. Unfortunately for Michigan, Ohio leveraged its influence in Congress to deny their petition, keeping it from even being voted on. Ohio made it clear, Michigan had to surrender its claim to Toledo if it ever wanted to become a state. Former President John Quincy Adams said of Congress's refusal to admit Michigan, "Never in the course of my life have I known a controversy of which all the right was so clear on one side, and all the power so overwhelmingly on the other." Not to get political, but I think there were, in fact, more morally definitive issues in 1830s America, but I digress. The situation had not improved by 1834 when the new governor of Michigan, Stevens T. Mason, came into office. Mason was a hot-headed young man, only 23 when appointed to the position by the equally short-tempered President Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a family friend of Mason and privately said he supported Michigan's claim. Emboldened by his ally in the White House, Mason spent the next year fighting over the Toledo Strip with Ohio's new governor, Robert Lucas. On February 6th, Ohio officially exercised its jurisdiction over the Toledo Strip by appointing local officials. 6 days later, Mason responded by passing the Pains and Penalties Act. The law made it so that any Ohioan who settled the Toledo Strip would be fined $1,000, the equivalent of $30,000 today, or serve 5 years hard labor. Governor Mason also mobilized his militia to defend against any Ohioan who dared risk inevitable pain and/or penalty by stepping foot in Michigan. Things came to a head in March as both Michigan and Ohio scheduled local elections in the Toledo Strip. To ensure the other side was unsuccessful, both rallied their militias. Mason led 1,000 men straight into Toledo on March 16th. Lucas likewise sent 600 men to Perrysburg, only 10 miles south. Ohio and Michigan were on the edge of all-out war. Indeed, this conflict came to be known as the Toledo War. Realizing a fight was all but inevitable, President Jackson finally intervened. This was the moment Mason had been waiting for. Sadly, his anticipation quickly soured into resentment as Jackson ordered him to stand down and surrender the Toledo Strip to Ohio. Jackson was a friend of Mason, though, and had expressed his intent to side with Michigan. Why would he suddenly side with Ohio? Well, the answer's simple. Even 180 years ago, Ohio was a swing state. Ohio voters held the power to decide national elections. Jackson, a Democrat, was already concerned whether his successor, Martin Van Buren, could get elected. Ohio had proved it wielded the power to stop Michigan's statehood. With that much influence, they could cost him the election. Since Michigan wasn't going to be a state in time for the vote, it was deemed more important to be in the good graces of Ohio. Also, I'd be remiss not to point out that Jackson was a dishonest, backstabbing fraudster, something we'll be sure to cover more in future episodes. After Jackson officially sided with Ohio, he sent surveyors to remark the Harris Line as the official border once and for all. Mason and his fellow Michiganders weren't going to take that sitting down. On April 8th, a posse was assembled by the sheriff of Monroe County, Michigan. They searched through Toledo for anyone promoting the ludicrous idea that the city belonged to Ohio. Among those they arrested was Benjamin Stickney, a pro-Ohio, if you will, socialite who was particularly outspoken on the issue. Stickney was dragged to the Monroe County Courthouse for a sham trial. Stickney fought voraciously by all accounts and had to be tied down flat onto his horse for the journey. Less than a month later, the largest battle of the war broke out 25 miles to the east of Toledo. At noon on April 26th, Jackson's surveyors set up camp at land owned by Colonel Eli Phillips of the Michigan Militia. The new border would put his property squarely within Ohio. Mason got word of this and immediately dispatched a force of 30 men to arrest them under the Pains and Penalties Act. The Michigan force surrounded the camp, and when the trap was sprung, 9 of the surveyors were taken into custody, one of whom spent months imprisoned in Michigan. Although shots were fired, no one was injured. In response, Governor Lucas granted $300,000 to his militia to protect Toledo. They also pledged to open a court of common pleas in Toledo and started assigning judges. Mason, never one to be outdone by Lucas, appropriated $315,000 to his own troops. Governor Lucas called up his militia. By his count, there were 10,000 Buckeyes ready to defend Toledo against anything Michigan had to throw at them. The true number of militiamen was repeatedly exaggerated by Ohio newspapers until Michigan headlines finally dared the Ohio Million try. On July 15th, Joseph Wood, deputy sheriff of Monroe County, Michigan, once again assembled a posse to arrest Ohio loyalists. Their target this time was the son of Benjamin Stickney, the man who they'd dragged to court last time, who had since been named the mayor of Toledo, at least according to Ohio. Stickney was still fuming mad over his kidnapping. His son, too, had become particularly hostile, having told Wood directly that the day you set foot in Toledo, your life will be in danger. Also, yes, his name was Two, spelled T-W-O. His older brother was named One, not sure if that makes it better or worse. Regardless of his name, Two was one to stand by his word, and Deputy Wood had indeed set foot in Toledo. In the ensuing chaos of the brawl that broke out during his attempted arrest, Two pulled a knife and stabbed Wood in the side, proudly declaring, "There, damn you, you have got it now." After being stuck once by Two Stickney, Deputy Wood and his men fled back into Michigan. Now, Andrew Jackson wasn't exactly known for being patient, and at this point he was more than fed up with Mason's antics. A month later in August, Jackson removed Mason as governor of the Michigan Territory. As a last act of defiance, Mason sent his men to Toledo to arrest the first session of Ohio's Court of Common Pleas in the city. The judges, made aware of what was coming, fled before they arrived and scurried deep into Ohio. Unlike the surveyors at Phillips Corner, they all avoided capture. Along with Jackson, Lucas and all of Ohio had by this point been pushed to the borders of their patience. Michigan likewise was frustrated that they still hadn't received statehood despite qualifying a year earlier. Despite Jackson, they refused to even acknowledge the new appointed territorial governor's authority and held an election of their own. As a territory, they weren't, strictly speaking, allowed to do this, but I'm sure you understand why they did anyway. I'm also sure you can guess who they chose. Less than a month after being sacked, Stevens T. Mason was back as the de facto governor of Michigan. Even with Mason back in office, the conflict turned from a raging boil to a low simmer for more than a year. To finally get Michigan to stop, Jackson offered compensation in June of 1836. If Michigan relinquished all claims to the Toledo Strip, they would be granted the land north of Michigan, known as the Upper Peninsula. Mason and Michigan's hodgepodge government, of course, rejected the offer. Nevertheless, even the most voracious Michigander couldn't ignore the writing on the wall. On December 14, 1836, Michigan accepted Jackson's deal and officially abandoned Toledo. Ohio, uncharacteristically true to its word, ended its campaign to block the statehood of its northern neighbor. On January 26, 1837, Michigan was admitted as the 26th state. Michigan entered the Union with its Upper Peninsula and without Toledo, meaning that the borders of Ohio were, for the first time in its history, unquestionable. The only blood spilled during the Toledo War was Joseph Wood's, who managed a full recovery. The same could not be said of Michigan and Ohio's relationship. The Michigan-Ohio rivalry has survived to this day, although mostly in college football. Wood, Mason, and the whole Michigan militia were disparaged as bloodthirsty rabble-rousers, leading to Ohioans giving them the nickname Wolverines. Now, if you remember the 1836 election I brought up earlier, you might assume Ohio voted Democrat after Jackson gave them Toledo. You would be mistaken. They voted for the Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison, anyway. He was, after all, an Ohioan, and Ohio royalty at that. He was the son-in-law of John Cleves Symmes, and just like Symmes, Ohioans have always tended to side with themselves. Michigan, on the other hand, despite being a territory, cast their votes anyway. Even after all the preceding drama, they chose to vote for Van Buren for no other reason than to stick it to Harrison and the rest of Ohio. By the time the election was to be called, though, Michigan was a state. Thankfully, Michigan only had 3 electoral votes, and Van Buren had won handily with 167 compared to Harrison's 73. To oblige the Wolverines, Congress simply read the tally twice, once with their votes and once without. Michigan was happy enough with the Ohioans losing this final battle that they went away with their tails held high. They also took the opportunity to elect Stevens T. Mason as their first governor. With the end of the Toledo War, surveyors were finally able to mark the Harris Line in peace, and literally set the last of Ohio's borders in stone. When the last of the border stones was erected in 1915, more than a century after Ohio's statehood, the governors of the 2 rival states shook hands across the border their predecessors had fought so valiantly over. Through dishonesty, corruption, and a healthy sprinkle of bullying, we're left with an Ohio forever shaped by controversy. Although a cursory glance at Ohio's outline doesn't inspire the imagination, I hope you've learned something interesting about the Buckeye State, and come to appreciate just how much history can be hidden in the shape of the Union. Whoa, hey, you're watching the credits? Oh, maybe you're just asleep. Well, regardless, I appreciate it. If you'd be so kind, I'd extra appreciate it if you liked the video and followed us here at Studio Alpaca. Be sure to join our Discord as well if you want to stay up to date with what we're working on. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.